Um, there will be economic relations. It's hard to cut them off 100%, even if you absolutely wanted to, and there are all kinds of backdoor ways of doing deals to get what you want. So there will be economic relations, but I think it's hard to see anything going back to like it was before, because the way it was before was discounted Russian energy fueling, especially Germany, but fueling a number of European countries. And generally speaking, Russia being on the back foot, having to accept all kinds of conditions and everything else. And that's going to be far less the case. I mean, they've had to get alternative markets, Russia has had to do discounts in order to sell much more in a short space of time into, say, India and China. But basically, when you look at the Russian budget, its revenues are pretty strong, and its budget deficit is only about 2%, less than most Western countries, and that's despite a big increase in war spending. So the Russian economy is doing fine and going to grow faster than all those guys as well. And so they would have actually less need than they used to see, because before and for a long time, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they more or less thought, that we're useless, we can't do anything, or that sort of thing. We need to get help from the West, need to do what they say. That's the only way to develop economically. Well, that option didn't work, because, the way the West operates is they don't develop other economies, they screw them up and exploit them. And now Russia's learned that lesson. And again, it will do individual deals where it seems to make sense. There won't be 100% prejudice, a complete block, but they won't trust any of these guys. And, maybe if and when the current generation get voted out or get replaced of political leaders in Europe, maybe it's a bit different. But it's kind of hard to see that. I think that it's probably worse for, say, the UK, where I'm from, because they're so rabidly anti-Russian, rabidly anti-Chinese as well, for that matter, more recently. For the Europeans, they've had a more pragmatic relationship, at least in business terms. So some of that could come through still. But overall, politically, they're going to be in a very weak position to do much that the Russians will trust. If they can allow Nord Stream, a major multi-year, multi-billion investment project, to be blown to pieces by the US, why would you trust them to build anything, any relationship? So again, it would be pragmatic things here and there, one-off deals, that kind of thing, but it won't be anything like we had before. And that will be to Europe's disadvantage. And, for the US, I really don't know how they can climb out of this big hole they've dug for themselves, actually. So they're continuing to dig and continuing to provoke conflict and wars all over the place, So I think that that's just gonna continue. And you say, let's assume the war in Ukraine is over, but number one, it isn't, and number two, the over bit of it will be a defeat of NATO and Western power in Europe. Or it would be a big problem. It already is a very big problem, but it'd be even bigger when there's a settlement of some kind, which I strongly believe will be more or less unconditional surrender by Ukraine, and more or less Russia gets what it wants, and there won't be anything they can do about it. Militarily, they're in no position to step up, send troops in, or do much to even increase, the ammunition or whatever they're sending to Ukraine. They've been such a mess even trying to do that. So I think they're in no position really to fight back in the near term. And longer term, if they want to, well, they probably could get their act together in a few years' time. And all of these think tanks, from the RAND Corporation to all kinds of other sort of think tanks, are all doing these forward planning things, what we need to do. And the problem they have is that they're in the huge mess with Ukraine and Europe. And at the same time, they're trying to kind of plan strategies against China around Taiwan and the general Asian situation. And there they've got even bigger trouble, basically, And all of the US military bases around China, yes, there'll be a problem, But the idea of the US attacking China militarily, I think, is certainly for the next couple of years is a bit far-fetched. But again, when it comes down to these powers thinking that, unless we do something, we're going to be relegated to also rans, and nobody will take us seriously anymore. And usually, we're in charge of the IMF, we're in charge of the World Bank, we fix the United Nations votes, we run the OECD, we run the Bank for International Settlements, we do this, we do that, we do that. We're in charge of all these things, basically. So if an alternative system is built instead, they see all of their treasures effectively evaporating before their eyes. So that means there could be a world war, frankly. Obviously we hope there won't be one, because somebody said if there's World War III, then World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones, because that's all we'll have left to play with. But it's a major, major crisis, and I would be more optimistic, if you like, about the West, so to speak, if there are any real signs of a decent political opposition movement that had some clout, but there isn't, and there's very little. I mean, in the US or Western Europe, there's all kinds of people who don't like what's going on, but often they've adapted to the reactionary sentiment around them, whether it be China or Russia or whatever else. And even over Gaza and what Israel is doing in Gaza, this probably a bit of a shock to some of them. It's been bloody obvious to everybody else for a very long time what Israel gets up to. But so you've got opposition now and people not liking it, but that's because there's a genocide going on right in front of your eyes. But actually, what are you going to do about it? Apart from demonstrations or something, and to call for divestment, yeah, good idea. I'd go along with that. But back in, again, don't really want to go back to the First World War, but there were actually dock workers preventing arms being sent to fight the Bolsheviks in Russia. So they're actually doing something to stop it, not just having a big demo and complaining and things like this. I say I don't want to cast any aspersions on the students. They're taking a lot of personal risk actually in what they're doing, but things need to go far beyond that over this issue, and it's questionable whether they will. And so from the point of view of getting any justice in the world, if there can't be justice for Palestine when you've got all this crap going on in front of your eyes, the other bits of justice for all kinds of other countries and peoples around the world, where's that going to come from, basically? So, I would see the Palestine issue as being really a kind of a litmus test for quite a lot of political developments today to indicate where somebody really stands regarding imperialism and their understanding of how the world works, basically. So I would like to think that Russia and China would, do something about that. I think it's pushing it a bit, and it doesn't look as if there's much going on in that direction. And frankly, they've got a lot on their plate anyway, with all the other things going on. But I think the major project which is in place to build an alternative world system outside of the control of Western powers, that's a fundamental major issue. Won't have seen anything like that being done for however. Well, Russia's definitely winning. The whole process is much slower than I thought it would be, frankly, and that's partly because it was a special military operation, not a war. So, and also they consider Ukrainians as brothers, not some foreign entity we have to destroy. So that's why civilian casualties have been minimal, basically. And most of them seem to be caused by, Ukraine's air defense missiles hitting buildings, that kind of thing. I think, though, that it's not over for Russia's aims. by quite some way. I think from the point of view of security, which is what it boiled down to right from the beginning, they would need to take the whole Black Sea coast of Ukraine, which means Odessa. If they didn't take Odessa, they would have this kind of quasi NATO base, forever trying to screw them up in Crimea and elsewhere. So I think that needs to happen. How soon? Who knows? I mean, maybe by the end of the year, but maybe that's a bit soon. But essentially, it is true what you say, that they had no real intention of taking over the whole of Ukraine. That was never the intention. But the problem is, how can you have you can rescue the more, if you like, Russian-orientated populations in the east and the south, but what can you then do about a bunch of rabid fascists who are anti-Russian, who are then being fed with Western weapons in the west of Ukraine? So that's a political issue they have to sort out. And I think at a minimum, it will be an imposition of no military whatsoever in that part of Ukraine. People have speculated upon having some kind of buffer zone or something like this, maybe along those lines. But the longer this goes on, the less of what's left of Ukraine will be. And the economy is a wreck anyway. Complete disaster. Most of the agricultural land got sold off to Western asset managers, and it's a complete basket case. And they mainly surviving for a whole number of years on the back of what was taken from the Soviet Union, effectively. And there could have been cooperation deals, and there were initially, up until 2014 at least. But all of that's out the window. So I think there'll be next to nothing left of Ukraine. What is left will not be allowed to be a political military threat to Russia. So all that, of course, that's some way down the line. That won't be in the next few months. That prospect is such a major political military defeat for NATO, the West, etc., that I don't see how they can climb down from that. They're going to have to, because that's, if you like, a minimum condition that Russia will put forward. And the Europeans, I'd more or less forget about them. They play no role. The Americans do, and the Brits in on that as well. But the most you get is that Trump's fantasy of sorting it all out in a couple of days, something like this. And yeah, in principle, they may try and put forward some kind of deal, but I don't see why Russia should trust any of it. All the documents that have come out have shown what they've been doing in Ukraine for the last more than 10 years, basically. And all the history going back, I've looked at a lot of this, shows that, MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service for the foreign countries in Britain, they were doing this from the 1930s, using Ukraine against Russia, against, the Soviet Union, as then was. So, I don't see there's any basis for any trust in whatever the West comes up with, and they're going to be faced with a demand for unconditional surrender. And I don't think there's anything they can do about it, So, however much destruction goes on is however much destruction goes on. It's a complete, catastrophe, really. But that's what that decision brought them, basically. Yeah, and I it looks like, if anything, who knows what's in Joe Biden's senile mind, but it looks like, they want to string it along at least until November, when he hopes that it won't be too embarrassing before then. And in the meantime, he's got Gaza to deal with, of course. But the American policy, whether it's Biden or Trump or anybody, is going to be seriously shaken by the failure of NATO and just the failure of American weapons, as we, seeing in Moscow today. They've got a number of them on show in a parade, in a May Day parade. Yeah, so it's hard to see how they can climb out of this huge hole they've dug for themselves politically, but they're going to have to, or there's going to be a world war, frankly. That's it. It's basically that having a drunk idiot like Yeltsin in charge was brilliant for them, because that meant that all kinds of Russian assets got sold off cheaply. They had all kinds of deals that they could use, and it's been a long-standing thing more in US than in European political circles about breaking up Russia, dividing it into 5 or 6 different countries, Um, and the reason they hate Putin is simply that he wasn't a drunken idiot, and he wanted to stand up for the country, basically. So that's what he did. He's a Russian nationalist, no way he's a communist, socialist, or anything of the kind. He basically pulled the economy and society out of a big hole, in the early 1990s that it had been in. And Russians have seen their living standards rise pretty sharply. They're not rich people, but, risen dramatically. And things have gotten markedly better, basically. That's why he has very solid popular support. So that's why they have to come up with, characters like Navalny, who never had any support, really, or a couple of percent. Just ridiculous to pretend that someone like Navalny had any popular support as a big dissident. And so what has happened, it's been a learning process for Putin as well, because initially, firstly, even talking about joining NATO, wanting to join the EU, doing all kinds of deals and everything, because he wanted to get the economy to develop and saw that the mess that had gone on before couldn't continue. But all of those efforts were basically pushed to one side by all the Western countries. And he only really put his foot down in 2008, I think it was, 07 or 08. There's a Munich Security Conference where he did a long speech. And as in all of his long speeches, none of the Western politicians listened to it or pay any attention to it. And they probably didn't read it either. But that made very clear that we're not going to put up with this crap. And we will not accept, Georgia and Ukraine going into NATO. And, we do not accept all of these rules that you're putting down. And we want to be treated with respect. Essentially, that was largely the context of it. And since then, everything he's done has been to build up different aspects of Russia's economy, its military, its international links. And the links, for example, they had a conference some months ago, I think now, of Russia-Africa links, and about more than 50 African countries came to it. And they're very strong links, because many people around the world saw Russia's anti-colonial position, or the Soviet Union's anti-colonial position, and there's a lot of benefits they get from that. And, people don't think, they're here to rip us off, which is generally what they do think with justification whenever US or European politicians come along and give them lectures. So the reason they hate Putin, the reason he's this big Hitler, in their view, is simply that he's standing up to Western power. And it was only done marginally before, and only developed further when he had no choice. The Minsk agreements from 2014, he was going along with them, basically, and do some deal, keep the Russian language as an option in the country, have some independence for the Donbass region, etc. All of this pretty easygoing stuff, frankly. And it didn't do much to oppose the growing war that the Kiev regime had launched on Donbass. Didn't really do much about it. There were bits here and there, and I think the Wagner group got going in there, and they no doubt gave them some arms, but not that much. So all of this has been quite a big learning process. And you could almost say that despite himself, Putin has become anti-imperialist. He wasn't planning to be, he just wanted to be a Russian nationalist, develop the economy, and keep the country together. But he's had to become an anti-imperialist because all these people trying to cut them to pieces. And I think that's what's happened, and it's not the traditional kind of Che Guevara anti-imperialist or anything like this. But basically that's what's happened. And as I say, he's got very strong positions, and I think there's enough people around him too that he's getting on a bit now. I can't remember exactly how old, but he won't be around forever. But there's enough of a political elite in Russia who are sensible enough to, I think, manage this through. And because they've done a good job of building up all these relationships on the basis of trust with all kinds of different countries, you have a relationship with Saudi Arabia, right? We're not going to interfere in what you're doing in Saudi Arabia, and you and me and many other people would say, bloody Saudis, what they do and what they get up to, but, no, it's a non-interference approach that Russia does and also China does. And that's appreciated by lots of countries who are used to being bullied. So it pays off, frankly, But I think the anti-Putin stuff will continue, more or less has to, but it will look more and more ridiculous. But who have they got? Can you name one single European politician who's not a complete moron or a lackey of US foreign policy? It's a joke.